He never thought a joke could turn into a fight for his dignity, but it did. A black police captain, trying to enjoy a day off, finds himself targeted simply for wearing a red MAGA hat, a gift from a friend. The call that sends officers his way isn't about his actions, but his appearance, his race, and the hat that marks him as other. What happens next will shake even the most hardened. But let's start from the beginning. Brian Carter, a black police captain, had longed for a break from the high-stakes world of law enforcement. On his rare day off, he headed to a nearby park to play basketball with a few colleagues. The warm spring air, the sun filtering through the trees, it was the perfect escape. As usual, he wore his red MAGA hat, a light-hearted gift from a friend during a community event. To Brian, the hat was nothing more than a joke, something that didn't carry any political weight for him. He didn't expect it to mean anything to anyone else. For him, it was just part of a laid-back day. Meanwhile, Karen, a middle-aged white woman who often walked her dog in the park, noticed Brian from a distance. She had seen him here before, but today something about him caught her attention. The bright red MAGA hat immediately set off alarms in her mind. Karen had always been quick to judge people who didn't look like her, especially when they appeared to stand out in her safe spaces. She immediately felt uncomfortable. To her, the hat symbolized danger, rebellion, and a defiance that didn't belong in this quiet suburban park. She didn't know Brian's story or why he wore the hat. To her, it was enough to see the color and the label. Without hesitation, Karen pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaky with urgency. "There's a black man in the park wearing a MAGA hat," she said, her tone tinged with suspicion. "He looks out of place, and I think he's up to no good." The dispatcher's questions were a blur as Karen described Brian, her fear clouding any logic. Brian, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. He was laughing with his friends, focusing on the game. But when he spotted the flashing lights of a police car pulling into the park, an unsettling feeling took root in his stomach. Something wasn't right. Something was about to happen. As the officers approached, Karen stood to the side, watching with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. She hadn't mentioned anything specific about Brian's behavior, just that he made her feel uncomfortable. That was enough. The first officer stepped out of the patrol car, a young white man, his hand resting on his holstered gun as he walked toward Brian. He eyed the MAGA hat with suspicion, his posture already rigid. "Hey, you," the officer called, his voice more commanding than necessary. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Brian's brow furrowed. He put the ball down, trying to assess the situation. "What's going on, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. "Are you causing any trouble here?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning Brian's face, as if searching for something. He didn't seem to recognize him, but that wasn't surprising. Most people in the neighborhood didn't. He didn't wear his uniform on his days off. "No trouble here," Brian replied, "just playing basketball." Before he could say more, another officer arrived on the scene. This one, an older man, looked at Brian with a sense of familiarity, but it wasn't a good kind. He had probably seen Brian's face in local news reports before, but only in the context of law enforcement. There was a sense of condescension in his eyes. Karen was watching intently now, her arms crossed, nodding to herself. She had that look on her face, one of silent victory. Brian could feel her gaze burning into him, could almost hear her thoughts. "I knew it. I knew something was wrong with him." Brian took a deep breath, deciding it was time to defuse the situation. "Officer," he said, standing a little taller, his voice steady. "You might not recognize me, but I'm Captain Brian Carter. I'm with the department." The younger officer blinked in surprise, clearly unsure of what to do. The older officer, however, looked momentarily taken aback before his face tightened. He took a half step back and glanced at Karen. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, looking at Brian's calm demeanor. Karen was stunned. The idea that the man she had just called the police on might actually be the police seemed beyond her comprehension. She didn't say anything at first, too shocked to process the information. Her grip on her phone loosened slightly as she realized the gravity of the situation. Brian's eyes never left the older officer. "I've been on the force for over a decade, and you should know," he added, "I'm not the one you need to be worried about." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "It's not me who's out of place here, officer. It's the assumptions you make." The younger officer, still unsure, began to back off. But the older officer wasn't so quick to let it go. He turned to Karen, his voice a little more measured now. "Ma'am, we'll handle this." But Karen's face flushed red, and she couldn't bring herself to speak. It had all happened so quickly. What if she was wrong? What if Brian was who he said he was? The idea that she might have just called the cops on an officer, a black man who had spent years in service to the community, hit her like a ton of bricks. The officers stood there, exchanging glances, trying to process the situation. The older officer finally addressed Brian. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, though it lacked genuine apology. "We'll make sure this doesn't go any further." Brian didn't take the apology. "It's not enough," he said firmly. "This kind of thing happens every day. Black people are treated like criminals on suspicion alone. You saw a man in a MAGA hat and assumed the worst." His voice was calm, but unwavering. "I don't expect an apology from you. I expect change." Karen, still shaken, began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't mean..." But Brian cut her off, his voice hardening. "You didn't mean to do what? To assume that a black man with a hat was dangerous? Or did you just think the hat was the only thing that mattered?" He looked at her with a steady gaze, his disappointment palpable. For the first time, Karen seemed to realize the full extent of what she had done. She stood there, silent, as the weight of her actions sank in. The younger officer, still unsure how to react, took a step back. "We should go," he muttered to the older officer. As they walked away, Brian turned to his friends, who had watched the entire exchange. "This is why we can't let our guard down," he said, shaking his head. "Even in a place like this." But as he looked back toward Karen, he saw something shift. Her posture was different now, her eyes not filled with judgment, but with something else. Shame. And for the first time, she seemed to understand the gravity of the assumptions she had made. Brian knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start, and that was something.